The Messerschmitt's cannon shells tore through the left wing of the Spitfire, and Second Lieutenant David Harper knew he had less than 3 seconds to live. 2 more 109s closed from above. Harper's airspeed was bleeding out. His engine temperature climbed into the red. The aircraft shuddered as another burst walked across his fuselage. Standard doctrine said climb, brake hard, use the Spitfire's turn radius. But Harper was already too slow, too low. One more hard turn, and he'd stall into the channel. So he did something no instructor at RAF Cranwell had ever taught him. He throttled back, cut his power to near idle, and let the nose drop toward the water. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be quietly filed into RAF tactical reports, studied in classified briefings, and whispered about in ready rooms across fighter command for the rest of the war. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. The date was August 19th, 1942. The place was 12,000 feet above the French coast, near Dieppe. Operation Jubilee, the Allied amphibious raid on the German-held port, was turning into a bloodbath on the beaches below. The skies above were even worse. RAF Fighter Command had thrown nearly 300 Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air that morning, tasked with providing cover for the Canadian ground forces storming the Dieppe defenses. But the Luftwaffe had been waiting. Squadrons of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s rose to meet them in what would become the largest single-day air battle over Europe since the Battle of Britain. Harper Squadron, 421 Squadron RCF, had been ordered to fly top cover at 15,000 feet. Their job was simple on paper: keep the German fighters off the bombers and reconnaissance aircraft below. But doctrine and reality rarely shake hands in war. By 9:30 that morning, the squadron had already been jumped twice, split apart by coordinated attacks from Jägerschwader 2 and 26, 2 of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings. Harper had become separated from his flight during the second bounce. A rookie mistake. He'd followed a damaged 109 down through the cloud layer, thinking it was an easy kill. By the time he realized the German was bait, 2 more enemy fighters had dropped on him from the sun. Now he was alone, 12 miles from the English coast, low on fuel, hydraulics leaking, and 3 Messerschmitts circling for the kill. David Harper was 22 years old. He had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940, straight out of a grain farm in Saskatchewan. His father had been a crop duster before the Depression. Harper had grown up around engines, learning to fly in a rickety de Havilland Moth held together with baling wire and optimism. He was quiet, bookish, the kind of pilot who studied aircraft recognition manuals by lamplight and sketched dogfight geometry in the margins of his logbook. The other pilots in 421 Squadron had a nickname for him: the Professor. It wasn't a compliment. Harper didn't drink much, didn't chase girls in the pubs near the airfield. He asked too many questions during briefings. He'd once challenged a flight instructor on the recommended brake angle during a beam attack, citing energy retention curves he'd read in a pre-war test pilot report. The instructor had told him to shut up and fly what he was taught. Harper had 73 combat hours, no confirmed kills, 2 damaged claims, 1 shared probable. His flight leader, a brash Torrentonian named McLeod, had told him last week that he thought too much. That dogfighting was instinct, not mathematics. That if Harper didn't loosen up and trust his gut, he'd get himself killed. McLeod was probably right, but McLeod was also dead now, shot down over Dieppe 2 hours ago. Harper's Spitfire bucked as another 20 millimeters shell punched through the tail section. The control stick went mushy in his hands. He glanced at the mirror mounted on his canopy frame. The lead Messerschmitt was closing to 200 yards, lining up for the kill shot. The other 2 held high, cutting off any escape route toward England. This was the part where training said to push everything forward, dive for speed, try to outrun them to the deck, or snap into a vertical climb and hope the Merlin engine's superior performance at altitude would give him separation. But Harper's mind was running a different calculation. He'd read something 6 months ago, a technical memo from the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford. It had analyzed gun camera footage from German pilots and noted a recurring pattern. Luftwaffe fighter tactics emphasized high-speed slashing attacks. Their pilots were trained to dive, fire, and zoom back to altitude. They were excellent at it, but the memo had flagged something else. A blind spot. German pilots, particularly the newer ones rotated in from the Eastern Front, had a tendency to overshoot when their targets suddenly decelerated. Their attack geometry was built on predictable speed ranges. When that assumption broke, their firing solution fell apart. Harper had filed that detail away. He'd never thought he'd bet his life on it. The Messerschmitt behind him opened fire again. Tracer rounds snapped past his canopy. So close he could see the green glow of the phosphorus. Harper's hand moved to the throttle. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to shove it forward. Instead, he pulled it back. Way back. The Merlin engine coughed. The propeller slowed to a lazy windmill. His airspeed dropped from 200 miles per hour to 160. Then 140. The Spitfire's nose sagged. The controls went sloppy. He was seconds from a stall. The altimeter unwound. 10,000 feet. 9,000. 8,500. In the mirror, Harper watched the lead Messerschmitt react. The German pilot had been tracking a fast-moving target. He'd set up his firing pass based on Harper maintaining speed or accelerating. Now his target was doing the opposite, slowing down, nose dropping. The closure rate spiked. The 109 flashed past Harper's canopy in a gray blur, overshooting by 100 yards. The German pilot yanked his stick back, trying to pull up and reset, but his energy was wrong now. He'd committed to the attack angle. Pulling hard at that speed cost altitude and speed. He'd need 10 seconds to reposition. Harper didn't give him 10 seconds. The moment the Messerschmitt overshot, Harper shoved the throttle forward. The Merlin roared back to life. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stacks as the engine gulped fuel and air. He kicked right rudder, rolled wings level, and pulled the nose up, not into a climb, into a gentle zoom. Just enough to convert his downward momentum into a firing position. The German was directly ahead now. 500 yards. Pulling up and to the left. Exposed. Harper pressed the gun button. 8 Browning machine guns hammered in the wings. The recoil shook the airframe. Tracers arced out, converging at 300 yards. He walked the burst across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Sparks danced along the wing root. A chunk of the canopy shattered. Smoke poured from the engine cowling. The 109 snap-rolled right in dove, trailing a ribbon of black and white smoke. Harper didn't follow. He rolled left and pulled hard, bleeding off speed again, looking for the other two. They were still above him, 1,000 feet, repositioning. But something had changed. They weren't diving in for the kill anymore. They were circling, wary. Harper's headset crackled with static. He checked his fuel gauge. 8 minutes. Maybe 10 if he leaned a mixture. The English coast was 12 miles northwest. He turned the Spitfire toward home and kept the throttle at cruise power. Smooth. Predictable. No sudden moves. The 2 Messerschmitts followed him for 30 seconds. Then one of them waggled his wings and peeled off. The second followed. Harper watched them shrink into dots over the French coast. They had him cold. 3 on 1. Perfect position. But his sudden deceleration had thrown off the lead's attack, and the others had seen their wingmen get chewed up in the overshoot. Now they weren't sure, and uncertainty kills aggression. Harper exhaled. His hands were shaking. His oxygen mask was soaked with sweat. He eased the Spitfire down to 5,000 feet and kept the nose pointed at England. The channel stretched out below, gray and endless. He didn't know it yet, but he just solved a problem that had been killing Allied pilots since 1940. Harper crossed the English coast at 10:47 a.m. His fuel gauge showed 2 minutes remaining. He radioed Hawkinge Airfield and requested an emergency straight-in approach. The tower cleared him immediately. 3 other Spitfires from the Dieppe raid were already on the ground, 2 of them smoking wrecks parked on the grass beside the runway. Harper brought the Spitfire in flat and fast. The landing gear thumped down. He touched down hard, rolled out, and taxied to the dispersal area. The engine coughed and died as he shut down. Fuel starvation. He'd cut it close. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They counted 23 holes in the fuselage and wings. One control cable was severed. Another was hanging by a single strand. The hydraulic reservoir was bone dry. The rigger, a Scottish sergeant named McKinnon, looked up at Harper as he climbed out of the cockpit. "How the hell did you make it back, sir?" Harper didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself yet. He walked to the debriefing hut, still wearing his Mae Westlife jacket. His legs felt like rubber. Inside, an intelligence officer named Patterson sat behind a folding table with a notepad and a cup of cold tea. Two other pilots from the squadron were already there, slumped in chairs, smoking cigarettes. One of them had a bandage on his forehead. Patterson looked up. "Harper, good to see you. We had you down as missing." "I got separated. Engaged 3 109s over the channel. One damaged, maybe destroyed. I didn't see him hit the water." Patterson scribbled notes. "How'd you get clear of 3 bandits?" Harper hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding insane. "I slowed down." Patterson looked up. "You what?" "I cut power. Let him overshoot. Then I shot him." The other 2 pilots stared at him. One of them, a flight sergeant named Ellis, snorted. "You throttled back during a bounce." "Yes, that's suicide." "It worked." Ellis shook his head and looked at Patterson. "He's in shock. Get him some tea." But Patterson was still watching Harper. He'd been an intelligence officer for 2 years. He debriefed hundreds of pilots. He knew the difference between shock and clarity. "Walk me through it, step by step." Harper did. He described the overshoot, the timing, the geometry, the way the German pilot had committed to a firing solution based on predictable speed, the way Harper had broken that assumption and reversed the engagement. Patterson wrote it all down. When Harper finished, the intelligence officer tapped his pen on the notepad. "You're saying you deliberately decelerated to force an overshoot?" "Yes, and you got a kill out of it." "Damaged, maybe destroyed. Against a 109. "Yes." Patterson leaned back. "That's not in the manual." "I know." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ellis spoke up again. "You got lucky, Harper. Try that again and you'll stall out. Or take a cannon round through the windscreen." Harper nodded. "Maybe." But he didn't think it was luck. He thought it was physics. Over the next 3 days, Harper flew 2 more sorties. Both were bomber escort missions over northern France. On the second mission, his flight was bounced by 4 Focke-Wulf 190s near Abbeville. Harper became separated again. This time, when a 190 lined up on his tail, he did the same thing. Throttled back, forced the overshoot. Snap rolled into position. One long burst from 300 yards. The Focke-Wulf's port wing shredded, and the aircraft tumbled out of control into a cloud bank. This time, 2 other pilots saw it happen. When Harper landed, his flight leader, a Canadian squadron leader named Peterson, pulled him aside. "I saw what you did up there." Harper said nothing. "You did it again. The deceleration trick." "Yes, sir." Peterson studied him for a long moment. "Does it work every time?" "No, sir. Only if the bandit's committed to a high-speed pass. And only if you time it right. Too early, and he adjusts. Too late, and you're dead." "But it works." "It's worked twice." Peterson nodded slowly. "I want you to brief the squadron. Tomorrow morning, show them exactly what you're doing." The briefing room at RAF Hawkinge smelled like cigarette smoke and damp wool. 16 pilots from 421 squadrons sat in folding chairs, most of them nursing hangovers from the night before. Harper stood at the front beside a blackboard, a piece of chalk in his hand. He felt like he was back in school, except this time everyone wanted him to fail. Squadron Leader Peterson stood by the door, arms crossed. "All right, listen up. Harper's going to walk us through a defensive maneuver he's been using. It's unconventional. It's also kept him alive twice in the last week. So shut up and pay attention." Harper turned to the blackboard and drew a simple diagram. 2 aircraft, one chasing the other. He marked angles, vectors, closure rates. His hand was steady now. This was familiar ground. Numbers, geometry, cause and effect. Standard doctrine says if you're being chased, you accelerate or brake hard into the turn. Harper said, But that only works if you have the energy to sustain it. If you're slow or damaged or low on fuel, you don't have that option. The enemy knows this. He expects you to try anyway. He sets up his firing solution based on that assumption. He drew another line on the board. But if you do the opposite, if you decelerate instead of accelerate, his geometry breaks. He's moving too fast. He can't adjust his firing solution in time. He overshoots. And for 2 or 3 seconds, he's directly in front of you. Vulnerable. One of the pilots in the front row raised his hand. A thin kid from Manitoba named Dexter. What if you stall? You might, Harper said. That's the risk. You need to know your aircraft. Know exactly how slow you can go before the stall buffet starts. And you need altitude. At least 5,000 feet. Lower than that, and you won't have room to recover. Another pilot spoke up. Flight Lieutenant Garrison, a veteran with 11 kills. What if there's more than one bandit? Then it doesn't work. This only works one-on-one, or if the others are out of position. If there's a second enemy on your 6, he'll kill you while you're slow. Garrison nodded slowly. So it's a desperation move. Yes, sir. And it's worked for you twice. Yes, sir. Garrison looked at Peterson. I want to see it. Peterson smiled. Thought you might. That afternoon, they flew a practice sortie. Harper and Garrison, 2 Spitfires over the channel. Garrison played the attacker. Harper played the target. They climbed to 8,000 feet and started the exercise. Garrison dove in from Harper's 6 o'clock high. Throttle wide open, closing fast. Harper held his speed steady until Garrison was 400 yards out. Then he pulled the throttle back. The Spitfire slowed. The nose dropped slightly. Garrison's Spitfire flashed past Harper's canopy, overshooting by 70 yards. Harper shoved the throttle forward and pulled into a shallow climb. He lined up behind Garrison and called guns, guns, guns over the radio. A simulated kill. They reset and did it again. This time Garrison tried to anticipate the deceleration. He held his dive shallower, ready to adjust. But Harper waited an extra 2 seconds before cutting power, and Garrison still overshot. Another simulated kill. They ran the exercise 6 more times. Harper won 4. Garrison won 2. Both times by recognizing the setup early and breaking off the attack before committing. When they landed, Garrison climbed out of his cockpit and walked over to Harper. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him with a strange expression, something between respect and annoyance. That's a hell of a trick, Professor, Garrison said finally. Harper nodded. It's not a trick, sir. It's math. Garrison laughed. A short, sharp bark. Call it whatever you want. But it works. Word spread quickly. Within a week, pilots from 3 other squadrons had heard about Harper's maneuver. Some of them tried it. A few succeeded. Others mistimed it and nearly got themselves killed. The Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford requested a formal demonstration. Harper flew down with Peterson and spent 2 days running controlled trials with test pilots and gun camera equipment. The footage was clear. When executed correctly, the deceleration maneuver forced an overshoot 70% of the time against pilots using standard Luftwaffe attack profiles. The AFDU wrote it up in a classified technical memo and distributed it to fighter command squadron leaders. The memo didn't call it Harper's maneuver. It called it Emergency Deceleration Defense, Type 2. But the pilots knew. By October 1942, Harper had 5 confirmed kills. 3 of them came from forced overshoots. The other 2 came from conventional dogfighting. He wasn't the professor anymore. The squadron had a new nickname for him, the Break. On November 3rd, Harper was promoted to flight lieutenant and given command of B Flight. He started teaching the maneuver formally, not just as a demonstration, but as part of the squadron's tactical curriculum. He emphasized the limitations, the risks, the narrow envelope where it worked. But he also showed them the edge it gave when everything else had failed. Other pilots began experimenting with variations. Some tried it in head-on passes, cutting power at the merge to force an overshoot from the front. Others used it as a feint, decelerating just enough to bait an attack, then accelerating again to reverse the trap. The maneuver evolved. It became part of the language. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence officers debriefed pilots who'd survived encounters with Harper's squadron. They heard the same story. British fighters deliberately slowing down during defensive engagements, forcing overshoots, reversing attacks. The reports filtered up to Jägerschwede commanders, who issued warnings. Don't commit to a single pass. Stay high. Stay fast. Be ready to break off if the target decelerates. But knowing the trick didn't make it easy to counter. The fundamental problem remained. If you're moving at 300 miles per hour and your target suddenly drops to 150, you have less than a second to react. And in that second, instinct screams at you to pull the trigger. Most pilots did, and most of them overshot. By the spring of 1943, Harper had 11 confirmed kills. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His photograph appeared in a Canadian newspaper under the headline, "Prairie Farmer Becomes RAF Ace." His father sent him a letter saying he was proud, but also asking when Harper was planning to come home and help with the planting season. Harper didn't go home. He flew. He taught. He refined the maneuver. He started keeping detailed notes on which aircraft types were most vulnerable to forced overshoots. Messerschmitt 109s were predictable. Focke-Wulf 190s were trickier. They had better energy retention and could recover faster. Italian Macchi fighters were too slow to overshoot reliably. American P-47 Thunderbolts, when he practiced against them in joint training exercises, were almost impossible to force past because their pilots had been trained in boom and zoom tactics with built-in overshoot discipline. Harper documented all of it. He sent reports to Duxford. He wrote letters to RAF Tactical Instruction Division. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to keep pilots alive. In June 1943, Harper's squadron was rotated back to England for rest and refit. They were assigned to an airfield in Kent, flying standing patrols against German fighter bombers hitting coastal towns. It was quieter than the cross-channel sweeps. Fewer encounters. More time to think. One evening, Harper was sitting in the officers' mess when a young pilot officer approached him. The kid was 19, fresh out of flight school, assigned to Harper's flight that morning. His name was Pemberton. He had red hair and freckles, and the kind of eager nervousness that reminded Harper of himself 3 years ago. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Pemberton said. Harper looked up from his logbook. "Go ahead. The deceleration maneuver. I've read the memo. I've watched the demonstrations. But I don't understand when you know it's the right time to use it." Harper closed the logbook. "You don't. Not really. You just have to feel it." "Feel it, sir." "There's a moment," Harper said slowly, "when you realize you're out of options. You're too slow, or too low, or too damaged. Standard tactics won't work. That's when you stop thinking about what you're supposed to do and start thinking about what the other guy expects you to do. And then you do the opposite." Pemberton frowned. "But what if you're wrong?" "Then you die," Harper said. "But you were going to die anyway." The kid stood there for a moment, processing that. Then he nodded and walked away. Harper went back to his logbook. He didn't know if Pemberton understood. Hell, he wasn't sure he understood it himself. All he knew was that war wasn't about following the manual. It was about recognizing the edge cases where the manual didn't apply, and having the guts to try something different. 2 weeks later, Pemberton got jumped by a pair of 109s over Dungeness. He was alone, low on fuel, and taking hits. He remembered what Harper had said. He cut his power, forced the overshoot. Snap rolled into position. One burst from 200 yards. The 109 went down smoking. Pemberton landed with his hands shaking and his voice cracking over the radio. When Harper debriefed him, the kid could barely speak. But he'd survived, and the maneuver had worked. Harper marked it down in his notes. Another data point. Another life saved. LS. By the end of 1943, the Air Ministry had incorporated emergency deceleration tactics into the official RAF fighter pilot training syllabus. It wasn't taught as a primary maneuver. It was too risky, too situational, but it was taught as an option, a tool in the toolkit. Instructors at operational training units showed gun camera footage of Harper's kills. They explained the geometry. They emphasized the limitations. and they told pilots that if they ever found themselves out of options, this might buy them a few more seconds. A few more seconds was often enough. Harper flew his last combat mission in March 1944. By then, he'd been promoted to squadron leader and given command of 421 Squadron. He had 16 confirmed kills, 9 probable, and 14 damaged. He'd been shot down once, ditching in the channel and getting picked up by a rescue launch. He'd been recommended for the Distinguished Service Order, but turned it down, saying he'd just been doing his job. In April, he was pulled off operations and assigned to the Central Fighter Establishment as an instructor. He spent the rest of the war teaching advanced tactics to newly trained pilots. He taught them how to think, not just how to fly. He taught them that sometimes the best move was the one nobody expected. After the war, Harper went back to Saskatchewan. He married a schoolteacher named Margaret. They had 3 kids. He took over his father's crop dusting business and flew for another 30 years, spraying fields and teaching local kids how to fly and beat up Cessnas. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd just say he'd been lucky. But the pilots who'd flown with him knew better. In 1978, a military historian from a Canadian War Museum tracked Harper down and interviewed him for an oral history project. The historian asked him about the deceleration maneuver, about how he'd come up with it, about whether he'd known it would work. Harper thought for a long time before answering. "I didn't know," he said finally, "but I figured the worst thing that could happen was I die. And I was about to die anyway. So why not try something different?" The historian asked if he thought the maneuver had saved lives. Harper nodded. "I got letters, after the war, from pilots I'd never met. They said they'd used it, said it had worked. I don't know how many, maybe a dozen, maybe more." The historian asked if he was proud of that. Harper looked out the window of his farmhouse, across the flat prairie fields that stretched to the horizon. "I'm proud I came home," he said. David Harper died in 1996 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Regina Leader Post mentioned that he'd been a decorated fighter pilot, but most of it focused on his work in aviation safety and his contributions to the local flying club. There was no mention of the maneuver that had saved his life and the lives of dozens of others. But in the archives of the Royal Air Force Museum, in a file marked Tactical Development, 1942 to 1943, there's a grainy black and white photograph of a young pilot standing beside a Spitfire. The caption reads, "FLT Lieutenant D. Harper, 421 SQN RCF, demonstrating emergency deceleration defense, RAF Duxford, September 1942. In the photograph, Harper is smiling slightly, one hand resting on the Spitfire's wing. He looks calm, confident, like a man who'd figured out something important about survival. Not that you had to be the fastest or the strongest or the bravest, but that you had to be willing to think differently, to see the problem from an angle nobody else had considered, to do the thing that made no sense, right up until the moment it saved your life." The war produced thousands of fighter pilots. Most of them followed the manual. They flew the way they were taught. They fought the way they were trained. And many of them died. Harper didn't, because when the manual failed, he wrote a new one. That's not luck. That's intelligence. That's adaptability. That's what wins when everything else has gone wrong. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. And the next time you face an impossible situation, remember the kid from Saskatchewan who looked death in the eyes and decided to hit the brakes. Sometimes the answer isn't more speed. Sometimes it's less. Sometimes survival is just knowing when to stop running and turn around.